The last human ship had vanished from galactic records exactly 3,000 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago. The Velthari collective remembered it well. Every species in the known galaxy remembered it because the disappearance of humanity had not been quiet. It had not been a slow fade, a gradual withdrawal, or a peaceful retirement from interstellar affairs. It had been sudden, absolute, final. One cycle, humanity's vast network of ships, stations, and colony worlds had filled the communication channels with their usual chaos. Their music, their argument, their strange transmissions about something called sports and another thing called weekend plans. And then the next cycle, silence. Total, complete, unbroken silence. Every human frequency went dead simultaneously. Every colony stopped responding. Every ship disappeared from every scanner in every corner of the known galaxy. 3,000 years of nothing. In the early centuries, the other species had searched. The Velthari had sent probes to human space. The Drenkai sovereignty had dispatched their finest explorer fleets. Even the Miathosian consensus, who had never particularly liked humans, had quietly redirected 3 scout vessels toward the coordinates where Earth was supposed to be. None of them found anything. Human space was simply empty. The stars were still there. The planets were still there. But every trace of human civilization, every station, every ship, every colony, every structure was gone as if it had never existed. The Velthari scientists had theorized extinction. A plague, perhaps, or a catastrophic war against an unknown enemy. The Drenkai had suggested dimensional collapse, a theory that earned them significant ridicule at the next galactic conclave. The Miathosians had simply declared humanity extinct, updated their records accordingly, and moved on with the practical business of dividing up what had been human trade routes among themselves. The galaxy had reorganized without humanity. New powers had risen. The Velthari collective had expanded significantly into the vacuum left by human withdrawal, claiming 17 former human border systems within the first 2 centuries. The Drenkai sovereignty had grown fat and comfortable, their merchant fleets dominating the trade lanes that humans had once controlled. The Miathosian consensus had quietly absorbed 4 human colony worlds that still had breathable atmospheres and useful mineral deposits, erasing the human names from their maps and replacing them with proper Miathosian designations. Life had continued. The galaxy had moved on. Humanity became history, then legend, then myth, and finally just a footnote in academic texts read by bored students who could not quite understand why their professors seemed to find the extinct species so fascinating. Ambassador Sarith Kale of the Velthari collective was not a being who frightened easily. In 400 years of diplomatic service, she had negotiated treaties between species who wanted nothing more than to annihilate each other, had sat in rooms with warlords and tyrants, and the occasional genuine monster wearing a diplomatic uniform, and had never once allowed fear to compromise her composure. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most experienced and unflappable diplomatic minds the galaxy had produced in living memory. So when the emergency signal from Velthari Border Station 12 activated every alarm on her ship simultaneously, and the station commander's face appeared on her screen with an expression that could only be described as naked terror, Sarith Kale felt the first genuine cold unease she had experienced in decades. "Ambassador," the commander said, and his voice was doing something it had no business doing. It was shaking. "We have contact." "Specify," Sarith Kale said, keeping her voice precisely level. "Unknown vessels, hundreds of them. They emerged from," he paused, consulting something off-screen, "from inside the Kereth Nebula, the deep interior, Ambassador, where our probes have never been able to penetrate. They came out of the nebula like," another pause, "like they had been waiting." "Identification." The commander looked back at her, and in 400 years of reading faces across dozens of species, Sarith Kale had never quite seen that expression before. It was the expression of someone whose understanding of the universe had just been fundamentally revised. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "they're broadcasting on the old human emergency frequencies." And he swallowed, "And one of them is hailing us. By name, they asked for you specifically. They said," he checked his notes again as if he could not quite believe what was written there. "They said, and I am quoting directly, 'Tell Ambassador Sarith Kale that humanity apologizes for the long silence. We had some things to take care of. We're home now.'" The silence on the bridge of Sarith Kale's diplomatic vessel lasted for exactly 4 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. The Velthari Collective's emergency communication network lit up within the hour. By the end of the first day, every major government in the galaxy knew. By the end of the second day, the Galactic Conclave had called an emergency session for the first time in 600 years. By the end of the third day, the stock markets of 4 separate interstellar economies had crashed, recovered slightly, and then crashed again as analysts tried to process the implications of what was happening and found that their models had no framework for it whatsoever. Because it was not just hundreds of ships that had emerged from the Karath Nebula. It was thousands, and they were not the same ships that humanity had sailed 3,000 years ago. Those old vessels had been impressive enough in their time, fast, well-armed, crewed by humans who had always had an unnerving tendency to solve problems in ways that no one else had anticipated. But these new ships were something else entirely. They were enormous. To begin with, the smallest vessels in the emerging fleet were 3 times the size of the largest Velthari warship currently in service, and the largest human vessels were so massive that the initial scanner readings had been dismissed as equipment errors because nothing that size was supposed to be able to move. And they moved with a smoothness, a precision, a complete absence of the energy signatures that any known form of propulsion should have produced, that made the Velthari's best engineers go very quiet and very pale when they reviewed the data. Sarith Kale accepted the hailing frequency with the composure that 4 centuries of diplomacy had given her, and the face that appeared on her screen was human. She recognized the basic architecture of the species. She had studied enough history, but there was something different about this human that she could not immediately identify. He looked young, as humans measured youth, with the dark eyes and easy posture of someone who had never been physically threatened by anything in his life. He was wearing something that was either a uniform or extremely casual clothing, and he was smiling in the particular way that humans smiled when they were genuinely pleased about something rather than performing pleasantness for diplomatic purposes. "Ambassador Sarith Kale," he said, "I'm Commander Davin Mercer of the Reclamation Fleet. On behalf of humanity, thank you for taking our call." "Commander Mercer," Sarith Kale said carefully, "the galaxy has many questions." "I imagine it does," Mercer said, and his smile did not waver. "We'll answer them. We're going to be very transparent about everything. We feel like we owe the galaxy that much, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Sarith Kale repeated. "You mean your disappearance?" "Our departure," he corrected, gently but firmly. "We didn't disappear, Ambassador. We left. There's a difference, and it's an important one." "You left," she said, "for 3,000 years." "Yes." "Without telling anyone." Mercer had the grace to look slightly apologetic. "That was intentional. We needed the time, and we needed to be undisturbed. If we had told everyone we were leaving and why, there would have been interference, attempts to follow us, possibly violence depending on how some of the more nervous governments at the time interpreted our intentions. We made a judgment call. We're aware it wasn't perfect." Sarith Kale regarded him for a long moment. In her experience, when someone began a conversation by acknowledging that their previous behavior had not been perfect, it was either a genuine attempt at honesty or a very sophisticated opening move in a negotiation. She had not yet determined which this was. "What did you need the time for?" she asked. Commander Mercer leaned back slightly in his seat. And Sirithkale noticed for the first time that the room behind him was filled with quiet activity, humans moving with purpose, consoles displaying information in a script she did not recognize, the low hum of systems operating at a scale she could not quite assess from a visual feed. "To get ready," he said simply. The Galactic Conclave met in emergency session on neutral ground, a station in the peripheral systems that had been built specifically for situations where the major powers needed to negotiate without anyone having home advantage. It had been used 6 times in its 800-year history. The 7th session was the largest in the station's existence, with representatives from 47 species crowding into the chamber, with a mixture of barely contained panic and the careful blankness of professionals determined not to show barely contained panic. The humans arrived exactly on time. There were 3 of them, Commander Mercer and 2 others who were introduced as Dr. Asha Reyes, described as a cultural liaison, and a tall, quietly watchful individual named General Yusuf Adjora, whose title required no further explanation. They sat at the table with the relaxed attentiveness of people who were very comfortable in rooms full of other species, which was already somewhat unsettling given that, technically, no living human should have had any experience with interspecies diplomacy. The Meathosian representative, a sharp-featured elder named Counselor Vrethanas, spoke first, because the Meathosians always spoke first and had never been successfully discouraged from this habit. "Humanity will explain itself," Vrethanas said, in a tone that made it sound more like a command than a request. "Of course," Dr. Reyes said pleasantly, "that's why we're here." She placed a small device on the table, and the chamber's displays activated with a visual representation that took several seconds to resolve into something the assembled delegates could interpret. When it did, the room went very quiet. It was a map, or rather, it was a map of what had been human space 3,000 years ago, overlaid with a second map of what that same region of space looked like now. The difference was significant. What had been a loose collection of colony worlds, space stations, and outposts connected by trade routes was now something else entirely. A dense, complex network of interconnected structures, installations, and what appeared to be entirely new stellar geography. Stars that had been dead or dying had been. The word that surfaced in Sirithkale's mind was tended, though she was not sure that was scientifically accurate. 3,000 years ago, Dr. Reyes said, humanity made a collective decision. We had been expanding outward for centuries, meeting new species, trading, negotiating, occasionally fighting, doing all the things that spacefaring civilizations do. And we had reached a conclusion as a species that we were not ready, not for what was coming. "What was coming?" asked the Drenkai representative, Admiral Koraz, in a voice that was working hard to stay neutral. "We will get to that," Reyes said. "First, the context. Humans we were at the time a very young species, barely a few thousand years of recorded history, a few centuries of space travel. We had incredible potential, but potential is not the same as capacity. We were making decisions in those early centuries that we did not have the wisdom to make well. Not yet. And we could see, projected forward, that our trajectory was going to cause problems, not just for us, for everyone." She paused, and the chamber was quiet enough that the station's environmental systems were audible. "So we made a choice," she continued. "The most difficult choice our species had ever made collectively. We chose to stop, to withdraw, to go home to our own space, our own systems, and to spend whatever time we needed becoming what we had the potential to be instead of what we were currently in danger of becoming." "You chose to evolve," Sirithkale said. Reyes looked at her with an expression that was warm and slightly surprised. "That's exactly the right word, Ambassador. Yes, we chose to evolve, deliberately, intentionally, as a species-wide project." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Before, it had been the silence of people bracing for bad news. Now it was the silence of people trying to process something that did not fit into any of their existing categories. 3,000 years, said Counselor Vrethanas slowly. You were improving yourselves for 3,000 years. Among other things, General Adjora said. It was the first time he had spoken, and his voice was quiet and even and carried the particular weight of someone who chose their words with great precision. We were also building. The map updated. What had looked like an impressive restructuring of human space became, as the new data layers rendered, something that required a fundamental reassessment of the scale of what humanity had accomplished. The installations were not just large. They were Surith Kale searched for the right word and could not find one in any language she spoke. They were foundational, deep space anchors of a kind that no known species had ever attempted. Structures woven into the fabric of several star systems, in ways that the Velthari's best physicists, reviewing the visual data in real time from their seats in the chamber, would later describe as theoretically impossible, practically achieved. How? Asked Admiral Koraz, and for once the Drenkai representative's famous composure had slipped entirely. How did you build? How is any of this possible? Time, Commander Mercer said simply, and focus. And the fact that when an entire species decides to do one thing and has 3,000 years to do it without distraction, the results tend to be significant. And the humans themselves, Dr. Reyes added. We changed, not just technologically. The people in this room right now, we are not the same species that disappeared 3,000 years ago, not in the ways that matter. We spent 3,000 years working on the things that were hardest for us: patience, long-term thinking, the ability to cooperate across differences without needing an external threat to force us to do it. The capacity to look at a situation clearly without the distortions that fear and ego and short-term interest create. She paused. We were not good at those things when we left. We are considerably better at them now. Counselor Vrethanas was staring at the map with an expression that Surith Kale recognized as the Meathosian equivalent of stunned disbelief. You said there was something coming, Vrethanas said. Before, you said you saw something coming. The temperature in the room seemed to drop slightly, though the environmental systems had not changed. General Adjora reached forward and touched the display device. The map changed again. What appeared now was not human space. It was deeper, further out, beyond the peripheral systems, beyond the outer reaches where even the most adventurous Drenkai scouts had rarely ventured. It was a region of space that most of the galaxy's civilizations had largely ignored because there was nothing there worth the travel time. Empty space, dead stars, the gravitational wilderness at the edge of the mapped galaxy. Except it was not empty anymore. The readings that appeared alongside the visual were in standard galactic notation, and every diplomat and scientist in the room could read them, and every single one of them went very still as the numbers resolved. We detected them 800 years ago, General Adjora said quietly. The first signals. We had built instruments by then that no other species had, and we pointed them at the deep dark, and we found what we had been on some level looking for. Or rather, dreading. What are they? Whispered someone from the back of the chamber. Surith Kale did not turn to see who had spoken. We don't have a name for them that translates well, Adjora said. We call them the Silence internally because of how they travel. They don't make noise. They don't broadcast. They move through space like something moving through deep water, patient and cold, and in numbers that suggest they have been doing this for a very long time. He let that settle. How long? Asked Admiral Koraz. Our best estimate is that they have been moving through the outer galaxy for approximately 40,000 years. They do not appear to be explorers. They do not appear to be traders or diplomats or migrants. The pattern of their movement, mapped across the signals we have been collecting for 8 centuries, is consistent with one interpretation. He looked around the room. They consume. They move into a region of space where there are organized civilizations. They take what they need. And they move on. The silence was absolute. "The civilizations they encounter," said Sarith Kale, and she was proud of how steady her voice was. "What happens to them?" "Nothing," Adjora said. "That is the most precise answer I can give you. The civilizations that the Silence have previously passed through, we have found the remnants of 6 of them in the deep outer regions over the course of our survey work. There is nothing left, not ruins, not wreckage, nothing, as if they had been processed." The Drenkai representative made a sound that was not diplomatic at all. "How long," said Counselor Vrethanas very carefully, "before they reach the inner galaxy?" "At current trajectory and speed," General Adjora said, "approximately 200 years, possibly less." The chamber erupted. It took 11 minutes to restore order, which was, Sarith Kale thought distantly, actually faster than she would have expected given the content of what had just been shared. When the noise subsided, Commander Mercer spoke for the first time in a long while. "We know," he said simply and without drama, "that this is a great deal to process. We know that our return has already caused significant disruption, and we know that what we have just told you is frightening. We are not going to pretend otherwise. The Silence is a genuine existential threat to every species in this galaxy, including ours. We have spent 800 years studying them. We have spent 300 years preparing for them." "Preparing how?" asked Sarith Kale. Mercer looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she would think about for a long time afterward, not quite confidence, not quite certainty, but something deeper and more durable than either. Something that looked like it had been built slowly, over a very long time, through effort and failure and effort again, until it became something that could not be shaken. "We built a wall," he said. The human fleet demonstrated its capabilities 3 weeks later, in a demonstration that every government in the galaxy had sent observers to witness, in a region of space that had been cleared and designated for the purpose. What the observers saw over the course of 6 hours was methodically and completely documented, and the documentation was later described by the Velthari Science Directorate as the single most significant revision to our understanding of physical possibility in recorded history. Humans did not show off. That was the thing that observers remarked on most consistently in the aftermath. There was no grandstanding, no deliberate theatricality, no performance of power for its own sake. The demonstration was precise and functional and explained clearly at each stage by Dr. Reyes and a team of human scientists who fielded questions, with a patience that several observers found almost unsettling given the context. "This is what our ships can do. This is why it works. This is how long it took us to develop it. This is where it fits into the overall defensive architecture we have built. Any questions?" There were many questions. The answers were given fully, and without apparent evasion. The thing that struck Sarith Kale most was not the technology itself, though the technology was extraordinary beyond any scale she had previously been able to imagine. It was not the scale of the fleet, though the fleet was vast in ways that made her previous understanding of vast feel quaint. It was the humans themselves. The scientists and commanders and diplomatic staff that she interacted with over those 3 weeks were different, not different in ways she could easily articulate. They were still recognizably human in all the ways she had studied, curious, adaptable, possessed of that particular quality that ancient records had described as stubbornness, and that she was coming to understand was something more like commitment. But the edges that old records had described, the volatility and reactivity and tendency toward dramatic escalation, those were muted or absent. These were humans who had, apparently quite literally, spent 3,000 years learning how to be the best version of what humans could be, and the result was something that was both familiar and entirely new. General Adjora found her on the observation deck of the neutral station on the 4th day, looking out at the human fleet assembled in the middle distance. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, which she appreciated. "You're worried," he said eventually. "I am processing," she said carefully. That's diplomatic for worried. She allowed herself a slight smile. The galaxy has reorganized itself around your absence for 3,000 years. Your return, even with the best intentions, even with everything you've brought back, is going to cause disruption. Yes, he said. We know, we've modeled it extensively. The disruption is unavoidable. We regret it. Do you regret leaving? He was quiet for a long moment, watching the ships. No, he said finally. I think if we hadn't left when we did, we would have burned, not intentionally, but we were heading toward a version of ourselves that would have caused great harm and eventually destroyed itself. The leaving was necessary. He paused. The not telling anyone that I regret. I understand why it was decided. I think it was probably the right call strategically, but I regret it. She looked at him. You talk about decisions made 3,000 years ago as if you were there. The Memory Project, he said simply. One of the things we spent the time on. Cultural memory, not just recorded history but lived memory, passed down through a practice we developed over the centuries. I carry the memories of 17 generations of my family line. Their experiences, their perspectives, their understanding of the decisions they made and why. He paused again. It changes how you think about time. Sareth Kale thought about this for a long moment. You are a very strange species, she said finally. We know, Ajora said, and he almost smiled. We've been working on it. The agreement that emerged from 6 months of negotiation was unlike any treaty the galaxy had produced before. The humans did not ask for their old territory back, which had surprised everyone and quietly relieved several governments who had built significant infrastructure on former human worlds over the past 3 millennia. They did not demand reparations for the appropriation of their space lanes. They did not, as the Drenkai had quietly feared, present a bill for 3,000 years of compound interest on various outstanding trade agreements that technically remained in effect under interstellar law. What they asked for was a partnership, a specific, detailed, practical partnership with clear terms and mutual obligations, oriented entirely around what was coming. The Galactic Defense Compact, as it was eventually called, was signed by 39 species. 8 species declined, for various reasons ranging from philosophical objection to simple disbelief in the threat. The humans recorded their refusal without comment and provided them with the same full intelligence package they gave everyone else, and left the door open. The preparation took 160 years. It was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. Integrating 39 different military traditions, technological standards, communication protocols, and cultural understandings of what chain of command meant was the largest organizational challenge in galactic history. And there were years when it seemed more likely to collapse into interspecies conflict than cohere into anything functional. The humans were patient through all of it in a way that Sareth Kale's granddaughter Sareth Vel, who had taken up her grandmother's diplomatic mantle, noted in her memoirs, seemed almost supernatural until you understood that these were beings who had spent 3,000 years specifically cultivating patience as a survival trait. General Ajora did not live to see the final battle. He died at the age of 143, longer than most humans had lived in the old records, though apparently within normal range for modern humans, and was remembered across the coalition forces with the kind of genuine grief that is reserved for people who have been, in the most practical sense, irreplaceable. His successor was a woman named General Orla Vasquez, who had served under Ajora for 60 years and had absorbed his quality of quietness without quite replicating it. She was, by multiple accounts, somewhat more direct. When the Silence's advanced scouts were detected crossing the peripheral boundary, she convened the coalition command in a meeting that lasted 45 minutes and ended with everyone in complete agreement on the operational plan, which was either a tribute to her leadership skills or evidence of how thoroughly the previous century and a half of preparation had aligned everyone's understanding of what needed to happen. The Battle of the Threshold, It was given that name afterward, though no one thought to name it during the actual event, lasted 19 days. The silence came in numbers that matched the worst projections from humanity's 800 years of observation data. They came in formations that had apparently not changed significantly in the 40,000 years they had been moving through the galaxy, which suggested either supreme confidence or the kind of deep inflexibility that comes from never having encountered serious resistance. They came with the patient, cold, absolute momentum of something that had never been stopped. They encountered the wall. The wall was not a physical structure, though it had physical components, deep space anchor installations that humanity had spent 3,000 years building, woven into the fabric of 14 star systems at the galaxy's edge, creating a defensive architecture that the Velthari physicists who had studied the plans for the past century and a half still could not entirely explain but could confirm, mathematically, should work. The wall was also a fleet, the combined forces of 39 species, organized and integrated and operating under a unified command structure that had taken 160 years to build, and that, in the first 6 hours of contact, proved its worth entirely. And the wall was the humans themselves, modern humans with 3,000 years of deliberate development behind them, tactical minds that had spent centuries studying the silence specifically. Scientists who had spent their careers solving problems that no other species had the foundational technology to even approach. Commanders who could hold a line under the kind of pressure that broke lesser preparations because they had been trained, explicitly, for exactly this. On the 7th day of the battle, the Silence's forward formations broke against the wall and did not reform. This had apparently never happened to them before, and their response, a massive concentration of force at the central anchor point, was exactly what General Vasquez had predicted and prepared for. On the 12th day, the coalition forces executed a maneuver that humanity's strategists had been developing for 3 centuries, and the Silence's command structure, to the extent that they had one, was disrupted for the first time in their known history. On the 19th day, what remained of the Silence's advance force retreated, moving back toward the outer dark in the same patient silence with which they had come, but no longer moving toward the inner galaxy. They did not return. Whether they had learned, in whatever way the silence could be said to learn, that this galaxy was different from the others, that something had changed, that the prey they had expected was not the prey they had found, was a question that humanity's xenobiologists spent decades trying to answer. The most widely accepted conclusion was simply that the Silence were, in the end, pragmatic. They had encountered something that cost more than it yielded. They would go elsewhere, or they would wait, or they would do something that no existing model could predict, but they would not come back to the same wall twice. Ambassador Serethvel, granddaughter of Sereth Kale, who had lived to the age of 422 and had died, according to her own wishes, on a small Velthari colony world with a view of a particular nebula she had loved, stood at the observation window of the Coalition Command Station on the 20th day, looking out at a galaxy that was still there. Behind her, 39 species were doing various things that expressed relief in 39 different ways, some of which were quite loud, and some of which were very quiet, and one of which, from the Drenkai contingent, involved a musical instrument she had never seen before and would not be able to get out of her head for the next several months. Dr. Lena Mercer, granddaughter of Commander Davin Mercer, carrying the family memory of his face on the screen 3 generations ago when all of this began, stood beside her. "Your grandmother spoke highly of your grandfather," Serethvel said. "He spoke highly of her," Lena said. "He said she was the most genuinely unflappable person he ever met, and that this was either the most admirable thing or the most alarming thing about the Velthari, and he never quite decided which." Serethvel laughed, a genuine laugh, not a diplomatic one. She would have said the same about him, the unflappable part. She paused. "Are they still out there?" "Yes," Lena said, without hesitation or false comfort. They are still out there. We are not naive enough to think one battle ends them. They have been moving through this galaxy for 40,000 years. They will adapt, eventually, to some degree. And there are other things in the deep dark that we have found preliminary signals of, things that are not the silence but that deserve attention. So this is not over. This particular phase is over, Lena said. The next phase is different, sustained vigilance instead of crisis preparation. Early warning systems extended to the full outer boundary. Continued development of the coalition's integrated capacity. The work does not stop. She paused. It never stops. We understood that before we left 3,000 years ago. It was part of why we left. We needed to become the kind of species that could sustain the work without burning out, without fracturing, without losing sight of why we were doing it. She looked out at the stars. 3,000 years is a long time, but the galaxy is older, and some of the things in it are older still. Sirithvel considered this for a long moment. My grandmother, she said, wrote in her private journals that she spent her entire career trying to determine whether humanity's return was the best thing or the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to the galaxy. What did she conclude? She concluded it was both, Sirithvel said, and that the difference between the two would be determined by choices not yet made. She glanced sideways at Dr. Mercer. She also concluded that for the first time in her 4 centuries of diplomatic experience, she genuinely trusted the species she was working with to make those choices well. Lena was quiet for a moment. Outside, the stars held their ancient positions, patient and indifferent in the way that only very old things can be. That means a great deal to us, she said finally, more than you know. Sirithvel nodded and looked back at the galaxy, hers, and theirs and everyone's still turning in the dark. I know, she said, that's why she wrote it down.